I've been reading this morning some of, I think it's Scott Atran or Scott Atran, something like that. Some of his writing that he did in response to the Beyond Belief conference, at which he got into a kind of intellectual sparring match with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, I think, certainly some of the folk. And his position argues that religious knowledge, if that's the right term, doesn't obey the same truth and falsity conditions, or it doesn't work to consider statements of faith in terms of their truth or falsity. He says they're more like poetic statements, which is, an idea that I'm kicking around myself right now. I'm just looking for analogues of that, because obviously he's getting a lot of flack for that, and I can understand that. But I'm trying to think of analogues in which we routinely accept aspects of experience kind of on faith or as poetic illusions, or use poetic means for understanding something as opposed to scientific means for understanding something, without it being a problem. A poetic method for understanding religion is a problem. It seems to be a problem for religious people because it seems to suggest that it's not true, or it's variable, or something like that. Because poetry has a slightly lesser status to other kinds of facts. But also it's a problem for empirical science, which would say that a lot of faith claims are incorrect. And that's, of course, they're incorrect, yes. And certainly organised religion, like all organised dogma, can be a problem. The politicization of religion is a problem. But in terms of religion itself as a branch of poetics, as I say, I'm trying to think of other analogues which we do routinely have no problem with. The one that immediately springs to mind is consciousness, which it's probably been fully explained in terms of its science. And I'm sure that the contributions of people like Dennett, would also, going back a bit more, Minsky, or the Churchlands, or anyone, Bellman, whoever. It may be that the mechanisms from consciousness have been pretty well laid out. I don't know if that's true or not. In a sense, it doesn't matter. The point is that our experience, that all those explanations point to the hard problem, as Chalmers said, which may not be that hard, which is that, while we have this odd subjective feeling of being alive and awake, and I know people like the Churchlands, or Dennett, or Minsky would say, there's nothing remarkable about that. It is fully explainable, and of course it is. But then we use words like the mind, and if you're asked to point to where the mind is, and you're using empirical understandings of the brain to explain it, you don't point to the mind, you point to the brain. So there's always that rather odd disparity, not spoken about extensively, just assumed to be kind of shorthand, really. So this mind is a sort of it's a shorthand way of talking about very complex cognitive processes, one might say. But we do talk about it consistently, and empirical scientists talk about it consistently. And people who are chasing down the neural correlates of consciousness talk about it consistently, as if it was a kind of entity that you could put against the wall and photograph. But to the best of my knowledge, no one has isolated what mind is, what that term actually means. we use that term, and we pass it across from one person to another as if we have the same understanding of it, but we probably don't. So in that sense, it is a kind of non-empirical entity that we have complete faith in because we experience it from the inside, so to speak. But that faith is not really justified other than through personal experience, which is exactly the same way, of course, that religious faith is ultimately justified in many cases. So that might be one example of a corollary to religious faith, I suppose. Cognitive faith, you might call it, psychological faith. The other one I was thinking of, and this is not such a good example, is the idea of the market, as they call it, the market. I'm reminded of Adam Smith's line in Wealth of Nations about the invisible hand of the free market. And of course you recognise that as a poetic illusion, that the market is a complex distributed system in which the value of commodities is very quickly communicated to the system in the form of prices, in much the same way that, I don't know, the pressure on one part of the body would show up as tension in another part of the body, something like that. So it's clearly just a metaphor, the invisible hand of the free market, but also it's one that we kind of buy into. We do talk about the market as if it was a kind of intentional being, even though we know it's not. It's quite clearly a metaphor, but it's a metaphor that describes more accurately and more intuitively the workings of that system as a whole than the lots of sort of atomistic information about how financial structures work and so on. I think it's sort of incidentally interesting that Adam Smith talks about his invisible hand a little bit at a different period of history and a different location of the planet. We have Karl Marx talking about a spectre stalking Europe, the spectre of communism, almost as if these two are possibly one invisible figures wandering around the planet, moving the value of goods and services around almost manually.